In Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. Two strangers met online in Westbridge during the pandemic, and what followed tied a CEO's guarded heart to a janitor's quiet courage in ways neither of them, nor a whole city scrambling to hold itself together, could have predicted. Chloe Kensington saw the Westbridge neighbors feed the way she saw every other platform: an instrument, a ledger, something to scan quickly and extract what mattered. During board crises and Zoom marathons, she had developed the muscle to skim snatches of information, contact points, a tidy map of need and solution. The neighborhood thread was background noise until a single post vibrated in the middle of a midnight skim. "Looking for someone who knows air transport," the message read. A local HR manager at SkiTech had emailed at 2 a.m., a line of panic about the demo flight crew. Chloe tapped a reply like she tapped a negotiation clause. She wasn't there to volunteer herself. She was there to marshal resources. Her fingers moved on autopilot. "If anyone can recommend an available rotary pilot near Westbridge, DM me. Time sensitive." There were the usual hundreds of replies about grocery runs and mask makers. Then, 4 minutes later, a terse DM. "I can help. Not commercial, but I can get you there. Hangar 9. The username was small and ordinary. The message was short and weirdly calm. Chloe scrolled back to his profile. One photo. An older, creased photograph of a low-slung helicopter in front of a tan hangar, the horizon baking in heat. A username could be anything. Competence could be a line on a resume. She'd handled crises that required parachute-rated pilots and third-party vendors. The thread was not where she expected to find a solution. Still, the line sat there like an unread file, while the rest of the city hummed with uncertainty. She typed the practical reply she typed to every outreach. "Who are you? Credentials? Availability?" "Held a rotor for years. Medevac, recon. Left active duty. If you need a ride, I'll do it," came the answer. Blunt, not a boast. No LinkedIn polish, just a hand extended in plain language. She could have forwarded it to the logistics lead and moved on. Instead, she felt, unexpected and small, a flicker of curiosity. The pandemic had hollowed out so many meetings into grids and schedules. A human response that didn't come out of a scheduler's spreadsheet was almost obscene, in the best way. She replied sharper than she'd meant. "We need a pilot at 9, SkiTech investors. It's a big presentation. This isn't a favor. It's high stakes." The user replied, 9, Westbridge Heliport. "I'll be there." She saved the name in her phone like an odd receipt, and then the world of corporate urgency reasserted itself. 100 emails to answer, a legal addendum to skim before lunch, a logistics person to call, a PR script to perfect for SkiTech's conservative board. She set the DM aside and proceeded to fight 1,000 small battles that were supposed to protect the empire her father had built. The morning chipped itself into fragments. Bad coffee, a tie chosen for optics rather than comfort, a phone that vibrated like a small animal. At 8:43, the logistics coordinator called. The contracted pilot's note was the kind of thing that made executives smell danger, medical emergency. No one could predict an ambulance on a suburban highway, not on the one day everything had to be perfect. There were backup crews, but not within range, and not with a clear weather window. SkiTech's investors were scheduled to be in town. The timeline was already baked into flights and investor patience. Chloe felt the old reflexive gears tighten. You cover the risk. You find alternatives. She scrolled through the neighborhood thread with more attention now than it had deserved in the months of pixelated social life. A man whose username did not match his resume had volunteered. She breathed, hit reply, and typed with the bluntness this moment required. "This is Chloe Kensington. Are you at the heliport?" A few minutes later, she was on the phone with Hangar 9, a voice low and ready, with a timbre that suggested early mornings and the smell of fuel. "I'm here," the man said. "I'm at Gate C." She could have arranged one of her staff to meet him, to vet him, to perform all the bureaucratic checks that would make a board member feel safe. That was the point of privilege. You never had to meet the unvetted. But her schedule had no time for more friction. She went down to Gate C. The heliport was a rectangle of sun and waiting aircraft, yellow painted lines and a folding table with logos. The world still felt guarded because of masks and distance. But there was movement. The commodity of people who knew other kinds of danger. She'd forgotten that the air smelled different, a mix of fuel and sun, and something that always made her think of being small and reckless and fearless in private. It made her brave or foolish, sometimes both. He was leaning on a broom like he'd been waiting for nothing in particular. The broom was incongruous next to a man who could steady a rotorcraft with his hands. The sight made something peculiar stir in Chloe. An irritation toward himself for never learning to calculate for such human unpredictabilities. He wore a janitor's jacket whose sleeves had been turned up and a cap that shaded weathering on his face. There was dust at the edge of his nails, a slip of gum at the corner of his mouth, and a posture that suggested he'd spent as much of his life down low as up high. He was younger than she had imagined, late 30s perhaps, with a patience folded into the straight line of his mouth. "You're Hangar 9?" she asked, mask tight, voice measured. He nodded, and his reply was the kind of simplicity that could not be captured by a resume. Liam Walker. For a moment Chloe felt the weight of standards, company policy, liability, optics, press against the rhythm of her lungs. She was CEO. She knew the world of reputations better than anyone. But in the 2 seconds before she could summon her scripts, he cocked his head and said, "You want to get to the Skytech demo? I can get you there, sir. I can make sure you arrive on time." He said sir like he was used to authority, like he had been inside uniforms that demanded the word. She suddenly understood why. The way he spoke was economical, respectful, and not performed. She slid the thin archivo of her defenses aside. "Can you? Are you licensed commercial, insurance, paperwork?" "I'm not commercial," he said, "but I can fly you." It was absurd. She should have laughed, should have called security, should have found legal and called for backup. The world of executives ran on procedures. She was an expression of those procedures. Instead, she looked at the man who had offered himself on a neighborhood thread and heard no boast, only a certainty that was not brash. Maybe it was the pandemic making everything feel more brittle, but she stepped forward and tried a different note. "Why help?" Liam tilted his chin toward the small, dented badge on his jacket. "No polished brass, nothing corporate. People need to keep their promises. You sound like you have one to keep." Her laugh was a little tight, and in the way of people who have lived long enough to protect themselves from sentiment. She made a decision that was pragmatic. "Okay. I'm taking a chance because I don't have a lot of choices. But you go by company rules in the air. Safety first. You follow my schedule and we do this by the book." He nodded once, an agreement. There were no stars, no medals, just the tilt of a man who had learned to accept orders and to follow them with a steady hand. He helped her into the helicopter as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The rotor hum was present before the blades flicked into planet-shaping motion. The sound was a low, tactile thing that vibrated through bone and nerves and memory. Liam's because he had lived inside that vibration for years. Chloe's because it struck at some private place she had closed off to everything that did not serve the bottom line. The flight itself was short choreography. The city shrank. The buildings became toys. The river a braided gleam. She had flown before in charters for investors, seen aeroplanes as another means of moving toward a meeting. But this was intimate. Liam's hands were sure on the controls, small gestures smoothing turbulence and shifting the machine like someone coaxing a reluctant animal. He didn't shout. He didn't perform for her. He was a quiet operator, attending the machine with a humility that bordered on devotion. A brief pause in the story. "Be honest. Have you ever met someone online who changed your life? Tell me your story in the comments." Halfway over the water, the rotor hum gathered around them, and for a moment the city slackened into a perfect silence that felt like a withheld breath. Chloe watched the muscles move at his jawline, the way he glanced at a cluster of instruments like an old friend, and she felt something unnameable settle behind her sternum. There was competence and a kind of grief in the way he accommodated the sky. The helpless cringe she had had, that corporate reflex to include risk in presentations, eased. At Skytech's demo site, after a short debrief and a miracle of timing, the executives filed in, and the presentation went ahead on schedule. Chloe watched them look up at the screen, watched her charts and numbers fold into the face of possibility and investor smiles. The contract signatures were on their way. She had leased herself a small success. The world would applaud her for nimble sourcing. She walked through congratulatory handshakes, and then, because she was not immune to curiosity, circled back to ask about the janitor who had flown them. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "I flew in the army," he said, voice low. "For a long time. Medevac, mostly. Left when my wife—" He did not finish. The sentence broke like a bone. Something in Chloe recognized the flattening of life after such a fracture. Loss was a language she had been taught not to speak in boardrooms, but she recognized it in a dozen private ways. The careful avoidance of TV shows that celebrated tidy endings. The subdued hollowness behind public smiles. She didn't ask the details. She had no right. Still, listening to him was like being handed a small key to a room she had kept locked. When she returned to the office, the screen of her phone lit up with the neighborhood name and the username that had become a real person. She grew impatient and fed with more curiosity than protocol allowed. She opened his earlier posts, comments about fixing a neighbor's fence, offering to run errands for elderly people, a photo of a child's drawing of a helicopter. It was simple, ordinary humanity. It was the kind of thing that rotated in the margins of her days, and would have been dismissed by anyone measuring usefulness in profit margins. She felt the odd sensation of wanting to know more. The next day she could have dropped the matter entirely. Instead, she visited the building's basement during a break, under the pretense of inspecting environmental control systems. The janitor's closet smelled of bleach and oil. There were mops hanging, and a scuffed locker with a child's sticker clinging to its corner. A forgotten name tag with L. Walker on it lay on the floor among trash bags and used rags. She pocketed the tag like an anthropologist collecting a relic. Her assistant, Marianne, peered at her when Chloe walked in late with the name tag on her palm. "You did not just go spelunking in the basement," Marianne said, half amused, half alarmed. "I met someone who helped us at the heliport," Chloe said. "He flew us in. Was he a pilot or a janitor?" Jordan cut in from behind a stack of printed contracts, enough to make a small fort. "Because this is the kind of thing that becomes a PR meme." "He was both," Chloe said. The phrase felt like a small concession in a life built on clean categories. She set the name tag down as if its presence might alter the office atmosphere. In a room of glass and concrete, an old plastic badge looked like a piece of humanity. That afternoon, she found herself searching public registries because she had the luxury of curiosity now. The luxury of someone who could let herself be sidetracked by a human story without disrupting the company's deliverables. She found a record. Liam Walker, service record with commendations, discharge after an honorable tour. A small, sanitized paragraph about a family, and then an absence. No LinkedIn, no corporate profile, no tidy pivot into consulting. "Where's the rest?" she muttered aloud, more to break the silence than to herself. The answer lay in the gap where grief resided, a silence that swallowed entire biographies. She didn't yet know Finn's name or the way his small hands drew helicopters with too many blades and a lopsided smile, but she felt the outline of a thing she could not yet name. A life reduced to essential tasks, stripped of the luxuries the rest of the world accepted as normal. It drew her in like a tiny magnet. 2 days later, Chloe stood in the kitchen of a rental townhouse across town. She should have been preparing for another round of investor calls. Instead, she had taken a detour that had more to do with curiosity than calculation. An email had arrived from the Skitech team. Pilot no-show solved. The sender had added a line in casual, amazed font. He was the janitor. She thought of the name tag in her drawer and the way the world had folded unexpectedly that morning into flight and trust. She felt a growing irritation at her own sentimentality. The company's image mattered. Her father had made sure she could never forget that. Risk lived upstream of compassion in his books. But something about being in the sky and feeling a man's steady hands on the controls burrowed under her armor. She was back at work when a photo slid across her phone. It was a jaunty little snapshot of a boy with a mop of hair and a helicopter scrawl in crayon. Someone had captioned it, "Finn loves to draw Daddy's sky." Her mouth made a small, impolite sound. A laugh that wasn't a laugh. She had never had children. She had always imagined that life would be a sequence of numbers and boardroom wins, with a husband who appreciated her ambition. Instead, here was a man whose world had narrowed to the measure of a child's breath, who had chosen an anonymity that protected a small, vulnerable person. The image tightened something in her chest that she couldn't name. At the next board meeting, her father, Roger Kensington, sat like an immovable column. He had the face of a man who had been practiced at disapproval since birth. His suit fit like a well-mended argument. He took the world in with one cold glance and catalogued it for threats. Chloe had been raised to expect his arsenal. The pivot questions, the sharp sift of concerns, the merciless tally of optics. It had kept her sharp. It had also kept her from falling in love with anything that could not be quantified. "How is Ski Tech?" Roger asked, already shaping the conversation. "They are conservative. The helm of that contract is either a crown or an anchor." "Contract signed," Chloe said. "One minor logistical hiccup solved by—" "By whom?" he asked, tone thin. "By a man in our building," she answered. "Liam Walker." There was a pause like a crack of dry earth. Roger's eyebrows made a small arch that meant trouble. "A man in our building?" he repeated. "A janitor." "He's a former army pilot," she said. "He helped us because we had no other option. He saved the timeline." Roger's dismissal was a thing of gentle gravity. "Chloe," he said in that particular way he had of lowering tone to make a command. "This company cannot be run on acts of mercy. It is a legacy. It needs stewardship." She kept the explanation short. "He didn't ask for anything. He refused payment." "Refused payment?" His voice sharpened. "Do you think his refusal absolves our responsibility? Be careful who you bring under our roof. This company represents more than good intentions." She closed the conversation with the practiced nod of someone accustomed to being both daughter and a CEO. But when the door clicked behind him, the name tag in her drawer felt like a small, combustible thing. She would have told him, in the slow language of later years, that sometimes stewardship meant seeing people rather than cataloging them. But she didn't say it. She was, in her father's world, the imperfect instrument of a very old design. That night she found herself scrolling the neighborhood thread again, looking for the username she'd saved. There were bits of ordinary life posted and a handful of messages from neighbors thanking someone called Liam for getting groceries, for driving an elderly man to a vaccine appointment, and once, a clip of a small child running across a backyard chasing a toy helicopter. The comments were a soft chorus of gratitude. It felt astonishing to her. This quiet life doing damage control for a world that had broken and was trying to mend itself. She messaged him again, not as Chloe Kensington of press releases and quarterly margins, but as someone who could not unsee what she'd learned. "Would you talk? Not about flying. About Finn." The reply came late. "Not here. Not with the kids in the house. I'll come by the office tomorrow." 2 minutes. When he walked into the lobby that afternoon, the building smelled like stale coffee and a faint lemon disinfectant. He carried himself as if he belonged to the background of the place, like the steel beams and dust. He had Finn with him, a small hand tucked into his. The boy clung to his father's leg with the particular security of a child who had learned what the world could remove in a blink. Chloe watched as they moved through security and into the elevator. Finn's shoes were scuffed, and his hair stuck up in a way that made him seem older for his smallness. He glanced at Chloe with curiosity, as if he had noticed her before in passing, like one notices a new picture on a familiar wall. He held out a crayon drawing without fanfare, a helicopter under a broad blue sky, the sun a precise orange. The blades were exaggerated and beautiful, the pilot a stick figure with a smiling face. "This is my daddy flying," Finn said, like it was a fact worth stating. Chloe took the drawing like it was a relic. She knelt down, because people's essential gestures were always more honest closer to their line of sight. "It's very good," she told him. "What's your name?" "Finn," he said, and then immediately added the kind of qualifier only 5-year-olds make. "I'm 5. "Nice to meet you, Finn. Thanks for the picture." Finn beamed. The kind of beam that actually changes a room. Small, unintentional, and clinical, because 5-year-olds do not yet dress their generosity in strategy. He ran back to his father's side and watched them stand up like a small unit. Liam's jaw worked, a sign of a man tensing against too much sentiment. He told Chloe, when she offered tiny corporate small talk that would have been routine in any other context, that Finn loved planes, and that his mother, Sarah, had taught him to name every part of the rotor. Chloe saw a photo tucked into Liam's wallet when he turned to fish for a policy card. A woman with laughing eyes and a baby swaddled close. She saw the same profile in Liam's face when he blinked quickly, and the reality of the choice he had made blurred in the edges of her perception. He had traded wings for a smaller, steadier life, because someone had to hold a child's hand through the dark parts. Later, as they sat at the small table in the company's glass atrium with its engineered light and expensive silence, she asked him the question that had been asking itself in her head since the heliport. "Why are you a janitor?" He met her with no defense. "Because it's honest work that lets me be home for Finn. Because I can afford a life that's smaller but consistent. Because in the army, when Sarah died, I decided the sky would wait if it meant keeping him safe." She thought of being raised to hold the family name like a shield, and felt, with a sharpness she hadn't expected, the constriction of it. "You could do consulting," she said before she could stop herself. "You have the skill set. Ski-Tech could use someone like you. They need hands that aren't theoretical." Liam's laugh was brief and unreachable. "I don't want to be on a stage counting my hours," he said. "I don't want my son to learn to be proud of me for applauses. I want him to know me as the man who comes home, makes pancakes, who cleans scraped knees. If I go back out there in a lined script—" "You don't have to work the same way," Chloe interrupted, because she hated mythology that boxed people. "We could set terms, consulting, part-time. You could protect your anonymity. We can pay for everything to make you comfortable." He shook his head. "It doesn't work like that. They come with obligations, publicity, interviews, a job that asks more of me than Finn needs. I won't risk being taken away from him again." She watched him, as if pulling to him a map of past wounds. And then she realized he was not telling her not because he thought she would betray him, but because the memory of loss sat like a weight he could not shift. "How old is Finn?" she asked, softer. "Almost 5, he said, and in his face she read 1,000 small victories. Dinner on time, a child's laughter in the night, the skill of making a bed without being told." The conversation folded into the ordinary things: lunchboxes, preschool, the way Finn loved to draw rotors with way too many blades, but under everything there was a gravity that did not want to be spoken aloud. Chloe left that afternoon with her mind restless. She'd offered options that could arrange into a career or leave a man exposed. Her father would have labeled her gestures naive. But she was not her father. She had always cradled the company like a thing fragile and valuable. It had been her crown. She had used it as armor. The man she had met in the neighborhood thread had shown her a different calculus. Value could be found in the invisible stitches that held a life together, not only in the patrimony you stewarded. Marianne intercepted her on the way out with an internal memo. "Roger has been challenging the change in the Ski-Tech PR," she said. "He wants a face that doesn't complicate things." "Does he know about Liam?" Chloe asked, and her voice gave the question away. It was not a rhetorical forensics exercise. She did not want Roger weaponizing his father's brand against a man who had helped them. "Not yet," Marianne said. "But you know how these things ripple." That night, Chloe sat alone at her apartment window and watched a city that still had dim lights and the quiet of people making do. The pandemic had transformed intimacy into a collection of small, necessary acts performed via screens and through windows. It had also taught her that the line between private life and public obligation could be porous. She traced the crayon strokes on Finn's drawing with her thumb and felt a strange tenderness for a gentleman she barely knew. Elsewhere, in an apartment that smelled of pancakes and machine oil, Liam folded Finn's school backpack and listened to the boy chatter about shapes of clouds as if they were personal revelations. He remembered holding Sarah in the emergency room and the way the sound of rotors had once been a hymn of purpose that had grown jagged with grief. He had been a pilot who had learned the geometry of risk and had been humbled by its outcome. The sky had a price the active life demanded. He'd paid enough. He had come home with a child and had sunk into a life of janitorial shifts and late nights that left little space for arrogance. Finn's sleep came with a clumsy exactness. A song hummed softly, a small hand pressed to a cheek, the rotor hum recorded in a frame like a memory. Liam pressed his mouth to his son's forehead and felt the neighbor username he had taken on in a moment of quiet necessity, Hangar 9. Close like an old underground mark. He had no illusions. If anyone at Ski-Tech ever asked about him, he would be careful. He had no use for headlines. He had use only for the slow work of being a father. Chloe came back into the story unexpectedly that weekend. The company had planned a local charity initiative to rebuild play facilities damaged in the neighborhood during the lockdowns. It was the sort of PR that read as compassion and also made for good footage. She thought of Finn and of the child's helicopter drawings. She volunteered the company to sponsor the playground rebuild. And then, more to test the edges of the man who had given them an improbable lift, she sent an invitation to Liam to coordinate the logistics with his community contacts. It was, on the face of it, a give-back. It was also a way of seeing him at a distance other than through flies and flight plans. He said yes, with thrifted caution. They met in a strip of a park still closed to group events and traded plans. Paint colors, safety anchors, donated benches. Finn ran in circles, small legs an engine of pure joy. Chloe watched him and felt a private unreality. A man could live under a corporate name, and an ordinary one at once. She admired the shape of his choices. He had chosen intentionally to give up the public sky to stand in the small sun of a child's life. It seemed to her both tragic and noble. But private choices have public consequences. News of Liam's flying ability had a way of spreading because nothing in the building ever stayed private for long. Marianne, overly fond of a good human interest angle, had mentioned the story to an old contact at Skitech who liked stories of unanticipated virtue. By midweek, a tentative invitation arrived at Chloe's desk. Would Liam consider performing a brief flight demonstration at a future investor summit? It was a polished email that smelled of corporate optimism. They talked about the opportunity to demonstrate pilot skill, to humanize the company's outreach, and to draw investors with an emotional arc. Chloe, who had been trying to shield him from precisely this kind of exposure, felt the dangerous lure of things that could fix problems neatly. This could be the bridge that set Liam on a course with stable income. It could also splinter the life he had carefully shaped around Finn. The offer was generous, but not innocuous. She told him about the proposal with the slowness of someone delivering bad news with a ribbon on top. He closed his hand around a mug until his knuckles whitened. "I don't want to go back out there," he said. "Not in front of microphones. Not in front of people who will ask about Sarah. Not in front of Finn's teachers when they—" "It's optional," she said. "They want a token demonstration. A short segment. There will be safety and compensation. We can structure it so you're anonymous if necessary." He laughed, small and brittle. "They'll want a face. They'll want a story. They like a narrative with me as a comeback hero. I am not here for comebacks." She felt the shape of a decision forming like a bruise. His refusal would preserve a small daily peace. His acceptance could lead to monetary stability and opportunities for Finn that her company could secure. He was the sort of man whose moral compass did not move easily when asked for favors. She could see the tightness in his shoulders when he thought about the publicness of it. Days later, the tension that had been simmering in the background of her professional life acquired a visible center. Roger Kensington summoned her to his office and asked direct, surgical questions about her involvement with an unnamed building employee. He wanted to know the exact nature of their relationship. Strictly professional, he suggested. But his tone implied he suspected otherwise. He watched her with the cool cruelty of a man who had left little room for tenderness in the numbers he kept. "You brought him into our orbit," he said. "Did you do a background check?" "He saved our demonstration," Chloe answered. "I followed up. He refused payment. He also has a son." "A community story can be an asset," Roger conceded. "But the narrative must align with the board's interests. We cannot be hostage to sentimental optics. People love a redemption arc, but they also love a tidy headline that leads to repeatable models of profit." His words were a practiced architecture of caution. Chloe didn't argue. She was too tired of arguing. But she also knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that she didn't want to turn a man into an asset. She wanted to see him protected. The board's mood, when she informed them in a calm corporate relay, was predictably conservative. They feared the unknown and loved the predictable safety of risk hedged by policy. A man with a military past, no LinkedIn, and a child's drawing could be spun either into a philanthropic headline or a liability. The conversation was a slow machine of calculations. Chloe felt like an intruder trying to propose a new math where a life was more than a set of asterisks on a spreadsheet. The board's questions pressed like neat needles. What are the PR risks? Is he insured? What if Finn becomes a liability? The language was sterile and pointed. She left that meeting with a decision curling in her mouth like a taste she would have to swallow. She could listen to her father and the board, smooth the edges, and never introduce him to Skitek again. Or she could push for him to be considered on his terms, with intentional boundaries designed to protect his privacy and his son's life. She had been raised in the tradition of risk management, but there was another part of her, small, clandestine, that had been moving lately toward a different dialect. Stewardship as intimacy rather than stewardship as legacy. Chloe chose the middle path. Always the path she had used to survive where others expected spectacle. She called Liam, structured an offer that insulated him from publicity, and walked a wire between generosity and caution. Consulting, she said. Remote, limited, with full confidentiality. We cover any plea for privacy. He listened. The rotor hum was a phantom present in her chest as she waited for his answer. I'll think about it, he said finally. And then, in the way the world often folds iron and silk before you can steady yourself, the board got wind of the outreach. Roger's voice when he learned of the job offer was not merely disappointed. It was an instrument playing the precise note he had always favored: correction. You cannot bring personal life into corporate governance without it costing you, he told her, which translated literally to, your personal compassion will cost the company's reputation. Chloe felt the old reflex to defend herself, to produce slides and numbers and reasons, but the facts had an odd way of throwing themselves in front of her compassion. She thought of Finn's crayon helicopters and Liam's flat, honest answers. She thought of the rotor hum that had sounded like revival and danger both. For the first time in years, she felt herself wanting to risk the thing she had built in order to protect someone else's small, brittle life. That night, after Roger had left the tall glass office and the building had cleared, she took Finn's drawing out of her drawer and smoothed the creases with the slow care of a guilty contraband. She called Liam, and though they spoke carefully, words like boundaries and compensation and confidentiality, pinging like legalities, they did not speak of the marrow of the matter. That two strangers had met online in Westbridge because a pandemic had forced a community to become more porous, and that such aperture had made a way for human lives to touch in a world that had been trying to keep everything clean and safe. She told him finally about the board's discomfort, and he told her finally about a night in a hospital where he had learned that some things, once broken, did not knit back the way they had been. He thanked her for the offer and set a boundary she could neither cross nor challenge. He would not perform for the cameras. Fair enough, she said. But fair enough lived uneasily in her mouth. She had offered a bridge. He had refused to cross for reasons she respected. They were both, in their different ways, protecting a child. She felt suddenly like an intruder in a life she had not imagined sharing, but had already entered by the single act of taking a ride in a helicopter and accepting a drawing. At the edge of this fragile piece, an email arced like a weather alert. Skitek's head of public relations wrote in gilded language that investors were enthusiastic about a dramatic, human element to the company's outreach and hinted, carefully, that investors responded well to authentic narratives. The implication lay flat as a tray on her desk. She looked at Liam's drawing again, at the lines and clumsy sun, and felt the tug between safeguarding a small life and the impossible trueness of doing good. The conversation with the board, already poised for soapboxes and subtraction, would push and pull her in ways she had not anticipated. Something had to give. The decision to protect or to promote would not be hers alone. The price of publicity is never paid in cash alone. It extracts a patience, a privacy, a surrender of small, quiet things. She wrote him a message that read simple and honest. They want you to demo. I won't push. No cameras, no interviews. I just want to secure Finn's future. He read it and replied with a line that somehow carried all the weight of a man who had learned to say no to grand narratives. I won't be a story. I can be a lift. I won't be a story. I can be a life for Finn. If you can arrange support without the spotlight, I'll think about it. Chloe read the line twice, like tasting the edges of a new language. His words were small and exact. They carried the freight of a man who had learned how to ration himself to keep what mattered alive. She felt, in that instant, how unfit she was for bargaining in measures that did not translate into quarterly earnings. She drafted a reply with hands that betrayed her, steady, corporate, but trembling at the margin. We'll structure it exactly how you want. No interviews, no public names. A fund, private, administered through a trust, education, medical, whatever Finn needs. We cover all costs. You run the terms. There was a pause, a tiny white space in which a private decision took form. When Liam answered, it was 2 words and a conceding breath. I'll consider. They spent the next week negotiating in ways people who never trusted proximity do. Emails, encrypted memos, and one brief in-person at a corner table where Finn sat with a picture book and a small hand that reached for both of theirs while they spoke. Chloe found herself translating corporate protections into a language that could hold tenderness. Specific clauses to shield privacy. A trustee who would manage funds and never mention the donor. A clause that forbade press releases. It felt like armor, but it was the kind of armor Liam needed. Roger found out anyway. Not because Chloe had faltered, but because the rumor mills thrived in the small arteries of power. He called her into his office, his tone a scalpel. You are putting resources into an unknown, he said. This company isn't a charity. It's not charity, she said. It's targeted assistance. It secures Finn's future and preserves his privacy. It also gives us practical expertise on pilot safety for ski tech. Something that benefits the company. He folded his fingers as if closing a ledger. We cannot be the city council. We cannot become entangled in narratives that chip away at shareholder trust. She met him without the show of submission. We won't. The deal is structured, no publicity. It's prudent, and it honors an obligation to a man who helped us when we needed him. There was an odd electricity in his silence, half relief, half calculation. He had raised her on a diet of risk models and contingency plans. She had learned the math of reputations the way other people learn their first words. Now she was proposing a different algorithm, a deliberate, quiet expenditure in human terms. He did not congratulate her. He could not. But in private that night, he read the memo she had circulated to the trustees and made a small adjustment to the language that softened liability without stripping dignity. The change was minute, and it mattered. The company announced to Skitech that they would supply an operational consultant for controlled safety audits. The consultant would perform closed-door demonstrations and report to the engineering team. The words were careful. When Skitech's PR officer asked for a human element to present at the investor summit, Chloe refused to let them cast a man into a spotlight he had not chosen. Instead, she proposed a different architecture. A live demonstration of pilot skill without revealing identifying details. Followed by an anonymous scholarship fund for children of veterans, an initiative Skitech could endorse without exposing individuals. It was the only acceptable middle ground. Skitech hedged. Investors liked the optics of a philanthropic tie-in. The board appreciated a predictable model. Liam agreed, reluctantly, because it meant money for Finn's future without the glare he feared. He trained in a surgically private way. Simulator runs in a nondescript hangar. Hours scheduled around preschool drop-offs, pre-flight checks conducted with a small, trusted technical team that signed non-disclosure agreements. Chloe watched from the edges, not to manage him, but to make sure the structures she had promised held. The training became a private scaffolding for an old skill. Liam's hands remembered instruments the way a pianist remembers scales, muscle memory before memory of the heart. When he sat in the cockpit for those early, quiet tests, the rotor hum threaded through him like a voice he had tried to silence. It did not lift the grief away. It did not promise a clean return to who he had been, but it offered a fit, an honest, bounded role that could coexist with pancakes at 6 and scraped knees at noon. Finn, who called everything his daddy's sky, began to accept that the air belonged to both of them in different ways, to Liam as a former life, and to the boy as a map of things he loved. He drew helicopters with careful attention to tails and rotors, and when Chloe came by with color-coded safety cones for the volunteer playground rebuild, Finn presented her with another crayon drawing, this time a small family holding hands under a helicopter. She kept them all. Marianne, who had a nose for human interest angles and a gentle conscience, tried to police the grammar of disclosure. "We're doing right by him," she said once. "But keep in mind people will want a face to put on it." Chloe steadied the answer with an honesty that had not been habitual for her. "No face," she said. "Just the work." The investor summit arrived like a bright, brittle thing. It was held outdoors at an airfield. They could not take the risk of closed hangars during public health precautions, and seating was staggered, a slow fan of chairs dotted with masks. A large screen showed a schematic of the demonstration. A few investors, a scattering of press, and the ski tech team had gathered. Chloe walked the perimeter with a clipboard she did not need. Her heart beat inside her like a smaller rotor. Liam arrived before he was required, a quiet presence among uniforms and polished steel. He stayed mostly to himself, checking instruments and nodding to a technician who offered readings. He had accepted the demonstration on one firm condition. Finn would not be in the crowd. They had negotiated it and then renegotiated the terms until they landed on privacy layered with controls. He watched the runway with a look that was more concentration than performance. Up close, the hum of the helicopters teased old ghosts out of him. Images of a hospital tower, of a wife's hand slipping away. He kept his focus on the present by naming steps in his head. Each one a small prayer to craft and to the promise he had made to himself to keep a boy intact. Chloe stood to the side of the control tent. For a long moment she felt the fraction of a child's terror. If anything went wrong, the headlines would be her inheritance. If anything went magnificently right, the world might still commodify him. Her father's voice, sharp with the arithmetic of image, echoed in her. She adjusted her shoulders and remembered why she'd promised protection at all. Not for a public accolade, but because someone had kept a fragile contract of human decency. When the demonstration began, the air thinned into attention. Liam ran through checks aloud, a steady litany of verbs. Throttle, check. Collective, set. Tail rotor, stable. He did not speak for effect. He spoke to machines and to his own hands. The rotors rose, a low vibration that crawled up through the soles of people's shoes. The first takeoff was textbook, clean, measured. A small miracle of mechanics and humanity meeting in the same movement. Then he opened the throttle just enough to carve a line in the sky. The helicopter skirted a wind shear, and then hovered like a held note. He executed a series of precision turns. A figure 8 over a painted marker. A slow bank that let the crowd see the craft from angles that made everyone hold their breath. The instruments flashed. On the ground, investors whispered appreciations that sounded like money wanting to be convinced. He did one thing that was not in the script, and it was small. He dipped the craft slightly, as if to wave. It was a gesture that held no rhetoric, only a human acknowledgement of shared gravity. Somewhere in the audience, a child clapped. Chloe felt something break open in a careful part of her chest. There was no cheering spiraled into fame, no attached biographies. It was what it had always had the potential to be. A man doing what he knew how to do, crisp and honest, and people made witness. When the craft settled and the rotors slowed, a polite applause lifted like a weather change. The fund announcement, carefully drafted and anonymized, ran across the screen. Scholarship Initiative for Children of Veterans, anonymous benefactor. The language was blunt and merciful, designed to be useful without being invasive. Finn, who had not been present but whose crayon helicopters had been, learned of the scholarship from his father in the way small children learn grand things, by being told between bites of pancakes. Liam had kept his promise about the spotlight, but he could not keep a secret from a 5-year-old. He told Finn that someone wanted to help kids like him learn, and that one day Finn might choose to fly or to paint or to cook, and that money should not be the reason he could not choose. The morning after, the office hummed with the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Investors sent polite notes. Skitech's engineering team sent technical questions. The board, who had been braced for catastrophe, had to parse a result that was tidy and useful. Roger, who had spent the summit in a silence that was strategic, stepped into Chloe's office later that day with a small, controlled expression that meant he wanted to be heard. "Your handling was—" he started, and then stopped, searching for an adjective that could bend toward approval without undoing his principle. "Prudent," he finished. "Conservative and beneficial." Chloe let herself feel the tiny fracture that was relief. She had not been reckless. She had been human and careful, and the two could coexist. Roger cleared his throat. "You did well," he said. And because he had never been fluent in sentiment, the moment carried the thinnest, hardest kind of warmth. He walked back into the hallway and paused outside the glass of the conference room where, through a door left open, he could see a man with a mop leaning, as if he had never been anywhere else. For a beat longer than necessary, his posture slackened, as if he were letting a memory arrive. Chloe watched him go, and she knew what apology he would or would not make. The company had not been dishonored. That was all he could afford to admit. Still, his concession was something akin to respect, and for her, that had the subtle effect of unfastening a small glove from her spine. The attention to Liam's skill had consequences she had not fully predicted. A small local outlet wanted to run a piece on the demonstration. They respected the agreement to keep names out of it, but they asked for context. Chloe, true to her word, answered in statements that framed the event around safety and the scholarship. The narrative that arose was one of practical heroism, no martyrdom, no cheap sentiment. Liam remained a background operator, his life intact, but the applause did what applause often does. It loosened offers. A training position came through an employer that specialized in emergency flight simulations. It promised stability and hours that could be scheduled with Finn's rhythms. It did not require publicity. It required presence. He weighed the offer in the same way he'd learned to weigh risk. Eyes on the horizon, hands steady on the controls of his own life. One late afternoon, after one of those days in which Chloe had balanced investor calls and paperwork, and the small, urgent calls of guardianship that felt both trivial and sacred, she found Liam in the rooftop maintenance room. He had climbed up to check a weather vane, one of those quotidian tasks that anchored him to the practical world. The sunset cut the city like a thin slice of copper. The rotor hum, faint in the distance, seemed to find them both. They talked, not about deals or press, but about small things. Finn's favorite pancakes, blueberry, not too many syrup rivers, and a training manual that no one had time to read. Liam told her about the small rituals he kept to keep the evenings normal. Bath, story, a kiss on the forehead carried like a transaction of safety. Chloe, who had practiced living like an architect of consequences, listened and learned the anatomy of a life that had been reorganized around love. She took a breath that had nothing to do with negotiating terms, and everything to do with admitting a possibility to herself. "I am thinking about life differently," she said. "I thought my duty was to the company in ways that meant never changing the edges. But I am realizing stewardship can mean making room." He looked at her then, with an expression that could be read as astonishment or gratitude. "You're risking a lot," he said. "This isn't a game you play halfway." She felt the truth like a bright weight. She had built a career on sheltering and inheritance, and on the hard algebra of protection. But the arithmetic of her life had changed too. She found herself wanting to spend time not in slide decks, but in a kitchen, with a child arguing about the best way to color a rotor. One evening, months after the demonstration, a small private ceremony took place at the airfield where the scholarship had been launched. Skitech announced a donation to the fund, not as a publicity stunt, but as part of a corporate match program. A trustee spoke in a voice that was steady and careful, and noted that anonymity was a gift that allowed dignity to survive. Liam stood in the back, not for attention, but because it felt right that he be present for a thing that would benefit many small children like Finn. Chloe watched him from a polite distance, feeling the mix of pride and something larger that could only be named in scraps. Gratitude, love, a recognition that the world sometimes allowed people to hold one another. After the event, Roger pulled Chloe aside. He looked older for a moment, as if the summit had aged him, but he was earnest in a way that surprised her. "I was wrong to sound suspicious," he said, his voice rawer than she'd heard it in years. "You did something that protected someone. That is stewardship, too." It was not an apology in the round, but it was the human thing men like him could do. A concession rendered as business. Chloe let it sit in her chest like a small warmth. She answered with the nakedness of someone who had learned the price of hiding tenderness. "Thank you," she said. The next morning, Liam brought Finn to the small hangar where he had been training in secret. The boy toddled among the dust motes like a comet, eyes wide. Liam crouched down and stroked the crayon drawing taped in his pocket. A family beneath a helicopter. He had been offered a position at the training firm, limited hours, predictable pay, and he had accepted it. Not because the sky promised absolution, but because it promised a steadiness he could count on. The scholarship was set up with strict confidentiality. The trustee had been selected by Chloe to be someone with a gentle discretion. Chloe arrived later with an uncharacteristically informal air. She had arranged a small rooftop moment at the airfield. No cameras, no flash, only a quiet place where the three of them could stand. The sky was a clean, honest blue. She took a breath that felt like a ledger item finally balanced with a life she had not anticipated. "Liam," she said, and then paused because words can sometimes strike like too bright tools. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small thing wrapped in a pilot's cloth. It felt like a gesture she had rehearsed 1,000 times in scenarios where everything could be controlled. He frowned slightly, wary of spectacle. She met his eyes. "I can't promise you a life without pain," she said. "I can't promise to erase what's happened. But I can promise to stand with you. To build a family instead of a headline." She unwrapped the cloth. It held no ring in the obvious sense of corporate merging or property transfer. It held instead a small plain band, something neither of them had to parade. She knelt, not because she wanted to stage a show, but because the motion felt right to her as a private covenant. "Liam Walker," she said, using his full name like a blessing. "Will you let me in? Let me try to be the life Finn deserves along with you? Not to erase the past, but to choose a future together?" He looked at her as if seeing her in a new light. The world had taught him to be cautious. His grief had been a careful map of places not to go. But here, under a sky wide enough to hold failures and new things, he felt the logic of risk shift. He thought of a child's small hand in his, of pancakes and midnight fevers, of the long, patient work of being present. He thought of the rotor hum like a remembered hymn. And he realized that a life could be tender without being fragile. "Yes," he said finally. Not a grand declamation, the word landed like a plane finding its runway. "Yes, we'll try, together." Finn whooped with the visceral joy only a 5-year-old can conjure, and ran in a circle that cut a small bright arc into the air. The rotor hum from a distant craft seemed to answer. In the way small rituals stitch lives, the sound became a motif for the new configuration forming under their feet. Roger, watching from a respectful distance, allowed himself the smallest relaxation of stance. He did not erase his cautions, but he made room for the consequence of kindness. The company would not collapse under the weight of a human life integrated into its edges. Instead, it would weather a subtle transformation. Chloe could not predict how all of this would